I'm Eleanor Hollister, 64 years old, and I haven't heard the sound of Howard's voice in 3 weeks. The house is still full of him. His jackets still hang by the door, and his glasses are still on the nightstand. This morning, I stood at the bedroom window and watched the light rain tap the glass while the house around me held its breath. Today is the reading of Howard's will. A part of me already knows what's coming, but I tell myself I'm imagining it. Our family has always been quiet, but not cruel. And yet I can't shake the feeling that after today, even that thin civility will disappear. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to sit through a family meeting, knowing someone hoped you'd walk away empty-handed, tap that like button and stay with me. Howard and I met nearly 30 years ago, back when I was a school counselor at Brookmeadow High. He walked into my office with a grief-heavy voice and a boy he didn't know how to reach. Bradley was 13 at the time, barely speaking to anyone, still reeling from losing his mother to cancer. Howard was in over his head, a single father trying to run the family drugstore and parent a son who locked the world out. He had silver at his temples, even back then, and a kindness that didn't try to prove itself. I offered support where I could, and over time, that support turned into something deeper. We married quietly the following year, and I moved into the Hollister home, a Victorian house that had once belonged to his late wife's family. Bradley never accepted me. I didn't try to replace his mother. I respected her memory, left her photographs where they'd always been, and stayed on the edges of his life unless invited. For a while, I thought he might come around. There were brief flickers. A joke shared, a question asked, a smile that didn't look forced, but they never lasted. As he grew, the distance between us hardened into something unspoken and cold. Howard held out hope longer than I did. "He just needs time," he would say after yet another dinner where Bradley barely acknowledged my presence. "Give him time, Ellie." And I did. I gave him years. Even when Bradley moved to Boston, became a lawyer, married Marissa, whose handshake could freeze a pond, and started his own family. The wall stayed up. I wasn't invited to their children's birthdays. When they visited Everglade, they met Howard at cafes, not the house. I kept trying until I learned not to take it personally. I told myself that some bridges stay half-built no matter how long you wait. But even Howard started noticing. In the last year, he would sit quietly at the kitchen table after a phone call with Bradley and stare out the window longer than usual. "Maybe I made it too easy for him," he said once. "Maybe I never taught him what it means to build something yourself." I didn't say anything then. I just poured his tea and sat beside him. I never cared about Howard's business ventures the way Bradley did. What started as a small pharmacy turned into something much larger. 3 locations, staff benefits, a regional mail-order system. Howard worked tirelessly but never chased luxury. We lived well, but simply. I contributed where I could, helped him launch support programs for elderly clients, organized training for pharmacists on how to speak with people who felt invisible. He called me his quiet backbone. I never wanted the spotlight. I just wanted to build a good life with him. Now I'm standing alone in the same kitchen where we once made breakfast every morning. His grocery list is still stuck to the fridge, his reading glasses still rest by the phone. I haven't moved a thing. Outside across the street, I see Bradley's SUV parked too early for our meeting at the notary's office. Marissa and the kids are with him. I watch them get out, walk past the house without looking up, heading into town. Not even a text. Not even a knock. I boil water for tea the way Howard liked it, strong, plain, no sugar, and sit with both hands wrapped around the mug. I already know I won't be part of their table today. I wasn't part of it yesterday. The air feels heavier than it should. And somewhere inside me, a quiet voice says, "Be ready." Whatever happens next, you'll need to keep your back straight and your heart steady. By the time I set out for the notary's office, the rain has eased, but the sky still wears its gray like a warning. I stop by the cemetery first, placing a bouquet of white lilies at Howard's grave. They were his favorite. I tell him I miss him, that I'll try to do this with grace, that I still don't know what he meant when he said I've made arrangements. But I hope wherever he is, he knows I heard him. I leave the cemetery and start walking toward the old brick building downtown where Mr. Gaines has his office. I don't know what I'll find in that will. I don't know what Bradley is expecting. But I do know this: if there's one thing Howard always believed in, it was letting the truth speak for itself. The waiting room at Gaines and Delaney had that old New England feel: dark wood paneling, quiet ticking clock, the faint scent of leather and lemon polish. I sat in the corner, hands folded in my lap, watching the rain slide down the outside windows. The door opened quietly at exactly 11 hours. Deborah Shaw Walters, longtime secretary, stepped in and gave me a gentle nod. "They've arrived," she said softly. "Mr. Gaines is ready when you are." I smoothed my dress, and followed her into the study. Walter greeted me with a firm handshake and a look that felt more like comfort than formality. "Eleanor," he said, "you can take your seat here." He gestured to the same deep leather chair I'd used before, the one that had belonged to Howard during their meetings. I sat, feeling the weight of the day settle in my chest. Walter remained by my side instead of retreating to his desk. I could hear the shuffle of footsteps behind the door. When it opened, Bradley was the first to enter. He looked sharp, tailored gray suit, silk tie, polished shoes that never touched a drop of rain. Marissa followed behind him in navy blue, one hand resting lightly on Lucas's shoulder. Savannah trailed behind, her eyes flicking around the room before settling on the floor. None of them looked at me as they entered. Bradley gave Walter a firm handshake and then offered me a small nod. "Eleanor," he said, like it was a business transaction. "Bradley?" I replied, holding his gaze just long enough to acknowledge him before turning to the others. "Marissa, Lucas, Savannah." A brief nod from Marissa. The children stood still, expressionless. Walter motioned toward the chairs facing his desk. "Please have a seat." Bradley hesitated a moment, glancing at the chair I sat in, then chose the one directly across from me. Marissa took the seat beside him, and the children settled in on either side. Walter returned to his desk and drew a manila folder from the drawer. "We are here for the formal reading of Howard Hollister's last will and testament," he began. "I'll read the document in full, and we can address any questions afterward. Please refrain from commentary until the reading is complete." Bradley shifted in his seat, and I noticed the slight clench of his jaw. Marissa's lips were pressed tight. Walter put on his glasses, unfolded the document, and began to read. "I, Howard James Hollister, being of sound mind and firm judgment, hereby make my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and testaments." The opening legal language floated past me in a hum. I focused on the creak of the old chair beneath me, the weight of Howard's ring on my finger, the way Bradley's eyes never quite met mine. Then Walter's voice grew more deliberate. "All of my estate, including my home, personal effects, financial assets, and the stock I own in Hollister Pharmaceuticals, totaling approximately $25 million, I divide as follows." Bradley leaned forward, fingers wrapped tight around the armrest. Marissa straightened slightly. "I bequeath 50% of all of the above estate to my beloved wife, Eleanor Margaret Hollister, as a token of my deep love and appreciation for her years of support, devotion, and wisdom." I heard a sharp exhale. Bradley's eyes locked on Walter, unmoving. Walter continued. "I bequeath the remaining 50% to my son, Bradley James Hollister. I express the hope that these funds will be used wisely and serve the well-being of his family. Bradley didn't move, but the tension in the room lessened slightly. Marissa looked down at her lap. Lucas and Savannah remained still, their faces unreadable. Walter turned the page and began listing Howard's directives in more detail: corporate oversight, charity bequests, asset allocations. Bradley's name came up again when Walter mentioned the business. The management of Hollister Pharmaceuticals, pending a final decision on its future, shall be taken over by a board of directors chaired by Frank Delaney. Bradley's mouth twitched. I knew he never got along with Frank. Their last exchange at the company holiday dinner had been nothing short of icy. Walter didn't pause. I specifically stipulate that the family home in Everglade, located at 17 Maple Street, with all furnishings and adjoining land, passes into the full ownership of my wife Eleanor, regardless of the overall distribution of assets. I hadn't expected that. I thought the house was part of the shared estate. But Howard had made sure it was mine alone. A quiet warmth moved through me, steady and grounding. That house was the center of our life together. Memories in every corner, echoes of laughter, and quiet evenings by the fire. Bradley sat back in his chair, stiff. Marissa didn't look up. Walter folded the document and set it aside. That concludes the reading, he said. Are there any questions? Bradley cleared his throat. Is this the most recent version? Walter nodded. It was signed 6 months ago in the presence of 2 witnesses and notarized. All legal requirements were fulfilled. Bradley seemed to weigh that a moment. Was there any mention of changes since then? Any addendums? None, Walter said. Everything is contained in the document I just read. Marissa leaned toward Bradley and whispered something too quiet to catch. He gave a slight nod, then he stood. Thank you, Mr. Gaines, he said. We'll begin coordinating with the board about our portion of the company. I'll speak with Mr. Delaney soon. He turned to me briefly. Eleanor. I'll be in touch. I nodded, still seated in the chair Howard had once occupied. Of course, I said. As they gathered their coats, Savannah glanced back and gave me a small wave. I returned it with a gentle smile. When the door closed behind them, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Walter looked over at me, his voice quieter now. How are you feeling? I gave him a faint smile. Like I'm standing in the middle of something I don't fully understand. He nodded. Howard knew what he was doing. He was deliberate in all things. I looked out the window. On the sidewalk below, I saw Bradley gesturing animatedly to Marissa. His voice clearly raised, even though I couldn't hear it. She answered him with clipped movements. The children stood nearby, unmoving. They'll have opinions, Walter said quietly. But you don't owe anyone explanations. Thank you, I said, rising slowly. For the tea, the calm, all of it. Howard was a friend, he said. I promised him I'd make sure you were protected. Outside, as I stepped onto the sidewalk, Bradley spotted me. He adjusted his tie and approached. We're heading back to Boston this afternoon, he said. We'll be in contact about the company structure. I've got a few ideas. I nodded. I'm sure Frank will be glad to hear them. We'll make sure everything's efficient, he said. Howard left things a little behind. I didn't answer. Just watched as he rejoined his family and walked to the car without looking back. As they drove off, I stood under the awning of the office, hands in my coat pockets. I should have felt closure. The will was fair, respectful, balanced, but something inside me stirred, unsettled. Howard never did anything halfway. His words to me near the end, I've made arrangements, kept echoing in my mind. And the look on Walter's face as he folded the will, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something was just beginning. The phone call came in just after sunset, when the living room was quiet, and the only sound was the low hum of the furnace kicking on. I saw Bradley's name flash across the screen and hesitated before answering. He rarely called. And when he did, it was never to ask how I was doing. Eleanor. He said, his voice clipped. I've spoken with Frank Delaney. We're losing ground in the market. The company needs a new strategy. I didn't know what to say at first. Howard had been pleased with the company's direction even in his final weeks. I'm not sure I'm the right person to make those decisions right now, I said. It's been less than a month. Bradley didn't pause. Which is exactly why we can't afford to wait. If you're not up to participating in board votes, I'll need you to sign over your proxy. I'll handle everything. The words came out so smoothly as if he'd rehearsed them. I'd like to speak with Frank directly, I said. He's more familiar with the current numbers. There was a pause on the line just long enough to feel the disapproval. Fine, he said. But don't say I didn't offer to help. After we hung up, I called Frank. He sounded surprised to hear from me, but warm as ever. Eleanor, the company's fine, no major issues. Sales have been steady, especially with the new generic line. Howard had everything set up for the next quarter. His calm tone reassured me, but it also made one thing clear: Bradley was trying to force my hand. Not just to influence decisions, but to ease me out entirely. 2 days later, Patricia called me first thing in the morning. I could hear the urgency in her voice before she even got to the point. Have you seen the Gazette? I hadn't. You might want to pick up a copy. There was a pause. Bradley's made a statement. I didn't ask what it said. I pulled on my coat and walked to the corner store, the air still damp from an early frost. The front page wasn't subtle. Hollister legacy, disputed son raises concerns over father's final wishes. Below the headline was a photo of Bradley, arms folded jaw tight. The article quoted him carefully, nothing overtly accusatory, but enough insinuation to make the reader question everything. He mentioned Howard's health, hinted at emotional manipulation, questioned whether recent changes in the estate reflected his father's true intentions. I sat at the kitchen table with the paper folded in front of me, unable to read past the headline. The phone rang again. This time, it was Walter. I've seen it, he said. We'll respond if we need to, but right now, it's just noise. He hasn't filed anything in court yet. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I don't want to escalate this, I said. Neither did Howard. Walter didn't argue. Just be prepared. But the murmurs had started. At the grocery store, I felt eyes linger a little longer than usual. At church, 2 pews over, someone whispered my name. One woman, a neighbor from down the street, placed a hand on my arm and said, "We don't believe a word of it." I smiled politely and thanked her, but I could feel the shift, small, sharp, and spreading. The next call came from a courier. A formal petition had been filed with probate court. Bradley was contesting the will, the claim that Howard had been unduly influenced, that I, with my background in psychology, had manipulated a grieving man, that I had used my role as wife and counselor to coerce a vulnerable husband into rewriting his legacy. I sat perfectly still after the delivery man left. The packet remained unopened on the table for hours. Later that evening, a letter arrived. It wasn't from Bradley. It was from Marissa. I recognized the envelope immediately, cream cardstock, her initials embossed in gold at the corner. Inside, her handwriting was careful and deliberate. Dear Eleanor, I write to you not in anger, but in the spirit of resolution. The current circumstances have been difficult for all of us. Bradley's grief has taken many forms, and his concern for the future of the Hollister business reflects his desire to protect our family's legacy. Lucas and Savannah are Howard's only grandchildren. He always hoped the company would remain in family hands. We understand this is painful, but perhaps there is a way forward, one that honors both your memories and our children's future. She didn't threaten. She didn't demand. But between every line, the message was clear. They wanted my share. All of it. That night, I walked the halls of the house past the family photos, the hallway bench where Howard would tie his shoes, the dining room where we once shared quiet breakfasts. I lingered in his study. Everything was still as he'd left it. The calendar stuck on the week he passed the pens in their cup, the sweater still draped over the back of his chair. I sat in his chair and closed my eyes. It wasn't the house I was afraid of losing. It was what it held. The memories, the love, the stillness of a life we built together. I wasn't interested in boardroom battles or newspaper rebuttals. I didn't want to spend months in court justifying 25 years of marriage. The next morning, I called Walter. "I've made a decision," I told him. "I want to keep the house. That's all." He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Let's talk tomorrow. I'll prepare the paperwork. But Eleanor, just think it over one more night." "I have," I said. "This is what Howard would have wanted for this place to stay whole, even if the rest doesn't." I ended the call and watched the morning sun pour in through the lace curtains, dust rising in quiet spirals across the hardwood floor. I thought of Howard's last words, how he wanted me protected, how he said he'd made arrangements, and though I didn't yet know what he meant, I felt ready to walk into the next chapter quietly, but not afraid. The morning sun lit the hallway in gold, casting long shadows through the lace curtains. I lingered by the front door, longer than I meant to, holding Howard's keys in my hand. They still had his old pharmacy tag on the ring, worn smooth with time. I hadn't touched the company mail in weeks, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Walter Gaines had prepared the paperwork. All I had to do was sign it and walk away from everything except the house. That part Howard had made clear. I arrived early, just like before. Deborah Shaw greeted me with a quiet smile, offered me tea, and ushered me into Walter's office. He stood when I entered formal this time, his tie neatly knotted, and his hands resting on a folder at the edge of the desk. "Eleanor," he said, "please have a seat. Before we begin, I need to confirm that you fully understand what this document means." I nodded. "I do." He studied my face for a moment longer, then pushed the folder toward me. The disinheritance form was just 3 pages. Dry legal language, clear, unemotional. All assets but the house would be signed over. No shares, no claims, no contest. I read every word, not because I doubted the terms, but because I knew Howard would have wanted me to be sure. When I reached the signature line, I took the pen Walter handed me and wrote my name with a steady hand. Walter didn't move. He sat back slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "That's everything," I said, sliding the folder back. But he didn't close it. Instead, he reached into the drawer behind him and pulled out a sealed envelope. My name was written across it in Howard's handwriting. "This," Walter said gently, "is something Howard asked me to hold in reserve. I wasn't to open it unless certain conditions were met." He tapped the edge of the envelope with one finger. "I believe today meets those conditions." Before I could speak, the office door burst open. Bradley stood in the frame, his face flushed and his tie askew. "I knew it," he snapped, pointing a finger. "Secret meetings, hidden documents." "What are you trying to pull?" Walter stood slowly, calm but firm. "Mr. Hollister, this is a private appointment. If you continue this behavior, I'll have to ask you to leave." Bradley didn't budge. "I have a right to know what's in that envelope. You're not going to cheat me out of my father's legacy." He stepped closer, eyes darting between Walter and the envelope. I stayed seated, unsure what to say. "Bradley," I said quietly, "there's nothing to hide. I've just signed away my share." He turned on me. "Don't lie to me. No one walks away from that kind of money unless they're scheming something. Walter stepped between us. Enough. Sit down. There was steel in his voice now. Bradley hesitated, then pulled a chair close and dropped into it, arms folded, glaring across the desk. Walter opened the envelope and unfolded a single page. Howard's handwriting covered the paper in familiar slanted strokes. Walter cleared his throat before reading aloud. If this letter is being opened, it means one of my heirs has voluntarily renounced their share of the estate, stating that money does not matter more than our relationship. In that case, I leave my entire estate, assets, shares, and holdings to that person, to the one who sees the value of love over wealth, to the one who does not fight for money at any cost. I entrust everything. Silence filled the room. I couldn't breathe for a moment. Bradley sat perfectly still, his face drained of color. "That's not legal," he muttered. "You can't add a clause like that without notifying us." Walter didn't flinch. "This document was signed 6 months ago, notarized and witnessed independently. It holds full legal weight." Bradley sprang to his feet. "This is a setup. You knew she'd come in here and pretend to give everything up just to trigger this clause." Walter shook his head. "Mrs. Hollister didn't know this clause existed. Her decision was genuine. The conditions have been met." Bradley turned to me, his voice sharp. "You manipulative." He stopped himself, then sneered. "Of course you knew. You've always been calculating. My father fell for your act, but I won't." I sat quietly. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to defend. No argument to win. Bradley stared at me, waiting for a reaction, but I had none to give. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the door. "I'll take this to court. You'll both regret it." He left without another word. The door slammed behind him. Walter sat back down, his hands resting on the edge of the desk. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. I nodded, though my hands trembled slightly. "I didn't want this," I said. "I only wanted the house." Howard knew that, Walter said. "That's why you ended up with everything." For a long moment, we sat without speaking. Outside, a breeze pushed against the window, shaking the old blinds. I could still hear Bradley's voice ringing in my ears, but it no longer held the same power. "I'll file the updated documents today," Walter said at last. "You don't need to take any action right now." I stood slowly. "Thank you for everything." "Howard trusted you," he said, "and I do too." As I stepped outside, I saw the same black SUV across the street. Marissa was sitting behind the wheel. Bradley stood on the sidewalk, arms waving as he spoke. Their children waited by the passenger door, still and quiet. When Bradley noticed me, he paused. Our eyes met for one long second. Then he turned back to his family, climbed into the car, and pulled away without a wave. I watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner. The air smelled like spring wet soil, warming grass, the faint promise of something beginning again. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel powerful. But I did feel clear. Howard had left me more than money. He'd left me trust. And today, I had answered it. The days that followed moved slowly like heavy curtains shifting in stale air. I went back to my usual morning rhythm tea in the kitchen, the mail at the front door, a walk through the garden, but nothing felt quite real. The envelope had been opened. Howard's words had echoed through Walter's office like a bell no one could unring, and Bradley's reaction had left its own echo behind. It wasn't long before the call came. Walter had warned me it might. Bradley had filed an official challenge this time, contesting the validity of the secret clause in the will. He'd retained a large Boston law firm and was pursuing a full trial. Walter brought me the papers himself. "We're ready," he said. Howard made sure of that. The court date was set for early summer. Walter's legal team worked quickly gathering documents and preparing witnesses. There was a video Howard had recorded 6 months before his passing, sitting upright at his desk, clear-eyed, speaking directly to the camera. He explained why he had added the clause. He described my role in his life. He said the money meant nothing if it didn't go to someone who valued people first. He had left a notarized letter as well. This clause he'd written is not to punish, but to protect. I want my estate to honor the values Eleanor and I lived by: honesty, care, and the willingness to let go of what cannot be controlled. Walter said the judge would appreciate the clarity. I only nodded. On the day of the hearing, I arrived early. The courthouse in Bennington was smaller than I remembered, just 2 stories, red brick, white columns. Inside the hallways were quiet, the sound of footsteps echoing off tiled floors. Patricia had come with me. She sat beside me on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When Bradley entered with his attorney, he didn't look at me. His suit was sharp, his shoes polished, but there was a restlessness in his movements. Marissa wasn't with him. Neither were the children. Just the lawyer and a briefcase that looked heavier than it should have. The hearing itself moved faster than expected. Walter's team presented the video and the supporting documents. 2 witnesses, both unrelated to our family, testified that Howard had discussed the clause with them personally at the notary's office during an estate planning seminar. Bradley's team tried to cast doubt, suggesting emotional manipulation, but there was nothing concrete. The judge asked careful questions, took notes, and in the end, ruled that the will stood as written. Bradley didn't speak as we left the courtroom. He walked past me with his head slightly turned, his steps clipped and tight. Outside, he paused only to shake hands with his lawyer. Then he got into his car and drove away without a word. Back home, I stood in the entryway for a long time before stepping inside. The house was still and warm. I hadn't realized how much tension I'd been holding until I finally sat down at the kitchen table. The clock ticked above the stove. A breeze passed through the open window, rustling the curtains. Howard's chair remained empty across from me. A few days later, Frank Delaney invited me to the office to go over the company's new quarterly plans. I wasn't interested in running the business, but I wanted to honor what Howard built. We reviewed the community program he'd started in his final year: discount prescriptions for seniors' mobile counseling outreach staff mental health days. Frank said the board was committed to expanding those efforts. "You're not just an heir," he said. "You're part of the legacy." That spring, I made one change of my own. I converted the old sitting room near the front of the house into a quiet consultation space. I didn't advertise it, but word spread. Once a week, I met with older neighbors, mostly women who just needed someone to listen. We talked about loneliness, about adult children who lived far away, about grief that lingered even when it had no words. Sometimes we just sat and watched the birds outside the window. Marissa sent one more letter. This one was short. She wrote that they had moved to California. Bradley had taken a position with a private firm out there. Lucas and Savannah had started at new schools. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. But she enclosed a school photo of Savannah smiling in front of a palm tree. There was a note at the bottom in careful script. "Tell Grandma I still remember the tea cookies." I put the photo in a drawer in the kitchen. One afternoon in late June, while clearing out one of Howard's desk drawers, I found a small notebook tucked beneath the receipts and spare envelopes. Most of it was filled with his usual scribbles, dosages, supplier phone numbers, inventory codes. But about halfway through, there was a page marked with a red paperclip. It had my name written at the top. There were only 3 lines beneath it, written in Howard's tidy, unhurried hand. Ellie always saw me for who I was, not what I owned. She's the only person who never wanted anything from me. If something happens to me, let this be known. I sat quietly with the notebook in my lap, the sunlight soft against the window glass. It was quiet in the house, but not empty. There was something about seeing it in his handwriting, something I hadn't expected. I ran my finger over the words, then closed the book and placed it gently back in the drawer. There were still things to do. The garden needed trimming. The pantry could use restocking. I had a few new appointments scheduled for the coming week. But in that moment, everything felt still. Howard had left the world the way he lived in it quietly, but with care. And though everything around me had changed, the center of it had not. I stood, walked to the front window, and looked out toward the street where the lilacs were starting to bloom. Somewhere miles away, Bradley was starting over. And here in the home, he tried to claim I had just begun again, myself. Late summer came with a quiet shift in the light. Mornings started cooler, and the breeze that moved through the Hollister house in the early hours felt softer, somehow less like emptiness and more like calm. I began spending more time in the converted sitting room, where I met with neighbors and a few of Howard's former clients who had heard I was offering appointments. I didn't advertise, and I didn't charge a fee. People simply came. One Thursday afternoon, just after I'd wrapped up a session with a woman named Clara, who'd recently lost her sister, I heard the front gate swing shut. I glanced through the window and saw a man standing at the edge of the walkway holding a small leather satchel. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with sandy hair graying at the temples, and a bit of a limp in his left leg. He looked like he wasn't sure if he should knock. I stepped out onto the porch. "Can I help you?" I asked. He adjusted his satchel strap and took off his cap. "I hope so," he said. "Name's Glenn Avery. I used to work with Howard. Years back before the second pharmacy opened." I remembered the name. Howard had mentioned him once or twice. Glenn had worked in the warehouse, then moved out of state when his wife got sick. "I didn't know you were still in town," I said. "Just passing through," he replied. "But I heard about the will. About everything that happened. I wanted to stop by and drop something off. It belonged to Howard. Thought maybe you should have it." He opened the satchel and pulled out a small wooden box. I took it carefully, the hinges cool against my palms. He gave it to me for safekeeping. Glenn continued. "Said I'd know when to return it. He was like that, always planning 5 steps ahead." "Thank you," I said quietly. "Would you like to come in for tea?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Can't stay long, but I'm glad you're the one still here." He gave me a nod, replaced his cap, and walked back toward the street. Inside, I placed the box on the kitchen table. It was plain cedar, no lock, no engraving. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside, I found an envelope, a flash drive, and a photograph Howard and I standing in front of the first pharmacy the day we reopened it after renovations. He had one arm around my shoulders and a pencil behind his ear. I smiled without realizing it. The envelope held a short letter written in Howard's familiar methodical print. "Ellie," it began. "If you're reading this, then something happened sooner than we planned. I don't want this to be about money. I want it to be about purpose. Inside this box is everything I started but didn't finish. Do with it what you think is right." The flash drive held folders, community health plans notes for an expanded seniors outreach program, even a pilot idea for a partnership with local schools to provide mental health education. I spent that evening reading, piecing together his vision. The next morning, I called Frank Delaney and asked for a meeting. We sat in his office, surrounded by files, and blueprints. Howard had a plan, I said. Not just for the business, but for the people it served. I want to follow through. Frank nodded, leaning back in his chair. We always suspected he was working on something behind the scenes. I handed over the flash drive. Let's see what's possible. Over the next few weeks, we met regularly. I brought in 2 local counselors I trusted, Margot Phillips, who worked in the school district before retirement, and Jonah Bell, a former VA therapist. Together, we drafted a new program under Hollister Health Senior Mental Health Advocacy free counseling hours and medication education workshops. I didn't take a formal title. I didn't want one. I just showed up, offered guidance, and made sure the heart of the business remained steady. One morning in early September, I walked into the Everglade location just as they opened. The smell of coffee mixed with the scent of vitamins and paper. A woman in a blue cardigan stood by the counter talking to the pharmacist. I recognized her, Mrs. Landry. Howard used to deliver to her during storms. She saw me and smiled. You're Howard's wife, aren't you? I am, I said, stepping closer. He used to sit with me when I was too dizzy to drive, she said. Said the medicine didn't matter if people didn't feel seen. I nodded. That sounds like him. She squeezed my hand gently before she left. Later that day, Frank pulled me aside. Bradley reached out, he said. He wanted access to some of the board's meeting notes. Nothing official. Just curious. Is he coming back? I asked. Doesn't seem like it. Said he's consulting for a private firm now. But he asked how you were doing? I didn't reply. That night, I sat on the back porch with a mug of tea watching the sky turn pink along the tree line. The house felt different now, less like something left behind, more like something coming alive again. The guest room still held some of Howard's books. I hadn't packed them up. I didn't plan to. But I'd moved his coat to the closet, washed the old sweater that used to hang on the chair, and opened the windows for the first time since spring. The next morning, I found a handwritten card in the mailbox. No return address, just my name. Inside, the message was short. Thank you for not giving up on what he built. S. I stared at it for a long moment before tucking it into my desk drawer next to the photograph Glenn had returned. A season had passed. Another was coming. I didn't know if Bradley would ever understand what Howard meant in that final letter. But I knew I did, and the work, like the love, wasn't finished. By late October, the trees along Maple Street had thinned out, their leaves curling along the sidewalks in shades of rust and gold. I'd taken to walking the same loop every afternoon after my final appointment past the post office, the old schoolhouse, and back down toward the pharmacy. It helped me stay grounded, reminded me that everything happening inside the house had a place outside of it too. On one of those afternoons, I found a small envelope tucked into my storm door. There was no return address, only my name written in neat block letters. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a photo Lucas and Savannah standing beside a carved pumpkin, both smiling in sweatshirts too big for them. The note was short. We're settling in. The kids miss Vermont. Savannah keeps asking about your cookies. M. I set the photo on the kitchen windowsill beside the little stone owl Howard bought on our last trip to Portland. The sunlight hit it just right that evening, casting a soft glow on their faces. Later that week, Frank stopped by the house with the final quarterly report in hand. We sat in the living room, the windows cracked to let in the scent of distant chimney smoke. The board's been impressed, he said, placing the folder on the coffee table. The new outreach program is exceeding expectations. I'm just following Howard's notes, I said. Frank gave a quiet smile. You did more than that. You gave it life. Before he left, he paused at the door. One more thing. I heard from someone you might want to know about. Bradley. I waited. He's been working on a healthcare project in San Diego. He reached out to one of our board members, nothing official, but he asked if we'd be open to collaboration down the line. I didn't speak right away. Then I said, "Did he mention Howard?" Frank shook his head. "No, just the company." After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a long while, letting the kettle boil past the first whistle. There was nothing to do but wait and see what might come next. A few days later, Patricia invited me to dinner. Just the two of us. She made meatloaf with creamed peas, and we sat in her dining room under the soft hum of the ceiling fan. I read about the Hollister grant in the paper, she said between bites. "It's a good thing, Eleanor. A real thing. Howard built the foundation," I said. "I just painted the walls." Patricia smiled. "That's still building." Before I left, she handed me a stack of old photos she'd found. Staff parties, school events, a few shots of Howard helping at a fundraiser years ago. "I thought you might want these." When I got home, I set them on the table and flipped through each one slowly. One photo in particular caught my eye, Howard standing beside Bradley at a career day event. They both wore name tags. Bradley was maybe 16. His arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable. But Howard had his hand on his son's shoulder. Not possessive, not proud, just steady. That night, I dreamed of the pharmacy in its early days. The wood shelves, the small bell above the door. Howard moving through the aisles, greeting customers by name. It was quiet, peaceful. The next morning, I received a call from Walter. "Eleanor," he said, "I've just received something unusual, a legal inquiry." "From Bradley?" I asked. "No." "From Savannah." I sat down at the kitchen table. "She's working on a school project," Walter continued. "Apparently, it's about family legacy. She wanted to know if there was any public record of the company's early history, specifically the programs you and Howard started." I smiled without meaning to. "She's 13. She's also curious, like her grandfather." After we hung up, I pulled the company's early documents from the file drawer in Howard's office. There was a brochure from the first clinic launch, handwritten notes in the margins, even a flyer with a cartoon pill bottle drawn by Howard himself. I made copies and addressed them to Savannah, care of their new address in San Diego. The next few weeks passed quietly. The days grew shorter. The nights came colder. But the house didn't feel heavy the way it had after the funeral. There was motion now. Letters exchanged, programs launched, even old colleagues stopping by just to check in. Then, just before Thanksgiving, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unmistakably Bradley's. It was longer than I expected. He thanked me for preserving the heart of the company. He said Howard would have been proud of the programs we'd built. He didn't mention the lawsuit. He didn't apologize, but he ended with a line that caught me off guard. Savannah asked if we could visit Vermont this winter. She said the snow in California doesn't feel real. If we came, would it be all right to stop by the house? I read the line twice. Then I folded the letter, placed it in the same drawer as Savannah's photo and Howard's old notebook, and left it there for the time being. The wind had picked up outside. Leaves skittered across the driveway. I stood by the window with a cup of tea watching them swirl, thinking of what it might mean to open that door again, not just to them, but to everything still waiting to be made right. It was the first snow of the season, soft dry flakes tumbling past the porch light, landing quietly along the stone path and window sills. I stood by the front door with a hand on the knob, listening for the sound of tires on gravel. The clock above the mantel struck 6. A minute later, headlights curved into the driveway. I opened the door before they knocked. Savannah was the first to step forward, bundled in a plaid coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She looked up at me, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, paper-wrapped bundle. "We brought the molasses cookies," she said. "Your recipe. I wanted you to taste them." Behind her, Marissa smiled gently. Bradley was slower to approach. He looked older than I remembered. Not tired, just quieter. When our eyes met, he gave a short nod. "Thank you," he said, barely above a whisper. I stepped aside. "Come in. The fire's already going." We didn't speak much at first. Savannah helped me arrange the cookies on a plate. Marissa took off her gloves and set them neatly in her lap. Bradley stood by the window, watching the snow gather along the fence line. After a few moments, he turned and looked around the room. "Nothing's changed," he said. "Some things," have I replied, "but not the parts that matter." He nodded again, slower this time. She kept asking. "About Howard. About you." I didn't want to give her the wrong picture. I waited. "I don't know if I ever saw it clearly myself," he said. "Back then?" We sat in the living room with our mugs, the plate between us, the fire low and steady. Savannah picked up a photo from the shelf Howard at the pharmacy, opening his tie slightly crooked, smiling, like he always did when he forgot he was being photographed. "He looks kind," she said. "He was," I answered. The rest of the visit passed without tension. We didn't rehash the court. We didn't dwell on what had been said in anger. The silence between words was different now, no longer edged, just honest. Before they left, Savannah gave me a quick hug. Next time, she said, "Can I see the room where he worked? I'll keep it just as he left it," I told her. "You're welcome anytime." Bradley lingered at the door as Marissa and Savannah stepped outside. He turned once more. "I don't expect anything," he said, "but if there's ever something I can do for the foundation or the company, I'd be willing." I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "We'll see." When the car pulled away, I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the cold with the snow gathering on my coat sleeves, listening to the quiet hum of the night. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. That evening, I took the cookies from the tin and placed them in a glass jar on the counter. It wasn't about the taste. It was the gesture, a recipe passed forward, a thread still connecting us. Howard had always believed in kindness over control, in patience over pride. I hadn't understood how much until now. He left behind more than a business or an inheritance. He left a pattern to follow, one built on grace, quiet choices, and the strength to start over, even after everything breaks. And maybe that's the part that endures, the quiet things we do not for applause, but because they're right. Thanks for staying with me through this story. If it reminded you of someone you love or someone you've forgiven, I hope you'll share it with them. And if you're still listening, I hope you feel just a little less alone.